So George, you say in your new book, Out of the Wreckage, that whoever creates the most powerful story rules the world. In this scenario, facts and evidence become of lesser importance and great stories are remembered and repeated. So my first question really is about books, and I wanted to ask you which book or writers, past or present, have most influenced your worldview?
I think there are two books that I would point to as my current lodestones. One of them is The Road by Cormac McCarthy. And I think it's the most important environmental book ever written. And the reason for that is that it's a thought experiment which considers a world without a biosphere. Some people have gone part of the way to where he's gone. Actually, most horror to do with wildlife is about too much of it rather than too little. It's about plagues of bees or birds or rats or some other creature. But this is much truer to any likely apocalypse which we might head towards, in that it's about an absence of wildlife, an absence of ecosystems, an absence of the entire biosphere, and the recognition that without that, well, the only thing left to eat is each other. And what is brilliant about the book is its relentless nature, the fact that it never lets up, it never gives you a spark of hope, because without a biosphere, there is no hope. So it's a sort of ground zero for environmentalism. The other book, which is currently having a profound effect on my thinking, so profound that it's taken me about 6 months to read. I've just finished it, because at every page I think, right, that's changed my entire worldview. I better read that again, is The Patterning Instinct by Jeremy Lent. It combines a marvellous sweep of cultural history. In its way, it's a sort of 21st century golden bough with cognitive neuroscience. It brings the two things together in a truly fascinating way and shows how our cultural environment shapes our cognitive pathways, for good or for ill, and shows how there have been some much more positive cultural environments as far as respect for each other and for the living world are concerned, than the one that dominates today. There have also been some pretty negative ones in the past, and shows the essential task in many ways is to break out of a culture that is driving us towards ruin, and to lay down, in doing so, new cognitive pathways that allow us to see the world and our position in it in a different way.
I recently read an article in The New Yorker by David Benatar, who is described as the world's most pessimistic philosopher. He's essentially an anti-natalist, and he contends that the kindest thing that we could do as human beings is actually not to have children and effectively end the human race. Your book, on the other hand, is exceptionally optimistic, and I wanted to ask you, what is it about human beings that enables you to keep the faith and keep the optimism?
I'm pessimistic about what we do and optimistic about what we are. The project before this book that I did was an album, a concept album called Breaking the Spell of Loneliness, with the wonderful musician Ewan McLennan. And it was in researching that album that the germ of this book was born, because one of the things I wanted to discover was why it is that loneliness hurts us so much. So I did a lot of reading about who we are in neuroscience, in psychology, in anthropology and evolutionary biology. And what I found in all those disciplines, to my utter amazement, was the same conclusion coming out again and again and again, that sure, we all have a bit of selfishness and greed in us, but overwhelmingly our dominant characteristics are altruism, empathy, kindness towards others, community feeling, that those trump our selfishness and greed by miles. And my first response was, I was furious, because I thought, we've been lied to for so long. We've constantly been told we're this self-maximising homo economicus trying to grab as much for ourselves as we can. And there's no science supporting that view whatsoever. It just doesn't stack up, except in the 1% of the population who could be classified as psychopaths, who unfortunately tend to be in charge. But for the great majority of the population, we really are not like that at all. And my second thought was, hold on a minute, there's a politics in this. You know, we've had a politics, we live with a politics which is built around the mistaken assumption that we're selfish and greedy, a politics we call neoliberalism, which says not only are we selfish and greedy, but we ought to be. It's a good thing because we can use that to accumulate as much money as possible, and that wealth will then trickle down to enrich everyone. Well, hasn't that worked out well? But if it's not true, if it turns out that actually we are fundamentally good creatures, that we, you know, that altruism and empathy are our dominant characteristics, but, you know, are constantly thwarted by the very negative and disturbing environment in which we live, then that's what we ought to build on. And we first of all have to recognise that, and then we need to say, right, so how do we bring that to the fore? And the exciting thing about this is it turns out we don't have to change human nature, we have to reveal it.
A little bit later on in your book, you have an analogy between soil and plants, and you talk about soil being the principles upon which we base our politics, and plants being specific policies. You then make the wonderfully expressed observation that in modern politics, we grow our policies hydroponically. They are essentially baseless, rootless, and they move with the wind. Why do you feel such an empty political status has developed?
It's a good question. I would take it back even a step further in that you've actually got three layers. You've got your values, which tend to be expressed by single words. They might be strength, courage, honesty, things like this. These are the, they don't necessarily live by them, but these are the notions that we think are most important. And that should be the bedrock of politics. And like religious communities, we should be able to identify our values. And from that bedrock of known and identified and expressed values, we then identify the principles on which we think society should be run. So for instance, we want to live in a world in which everybody has a fair economic share, and economic life is designed to ensure that we all thrive without bursting through the natural boundaries of the planet. And that's a principle which should be able to last hundreds of years, thousands of years. It's a basic concept of how we ought to live. And so you should be able to base your politics on principles underlaid by values. So the principles are the soil that derives from the bedrock, which is the values. And from that soil, the policies should grow. We say, right, if these are our principles, and here we are in 2017, trying to work out how to navigate the situation we're in, let's derive from those principles, let's grow from those principles the policies which help us to get through this situation. But without the values and without the principles, which politics signally fails to identify and express these days, all we are left with are the policies. So they say, you, the people who are going to vote, here are these policies and we want you to attach yourselves to them. And you say, oh, well, all right then. So you attach yourselves to the policies. And in a few years' time, those policies have to change, because policies do have to change. And then you say, oh, sorry, you've got to break your attachment to those policies, and here are some new policies to attach yourself to. Politics doesn't work like that. People just can't break attachments and reattach, and they just give up on politics, they give up on the parties. What religion does very well is to say, here are our values, here are our principles, they are immutable, they are unchanging. We might have to change our policies as time goes by, women priests, gay marriage, whatever it might be, but we have some basic values and principles which might be, the values might be love, kindness, etc. Those don't change, which is why religions last and politics comes and goes. And we have to learn from that. And we have to see that if we're to build a better world, it can't be built on these ephemeral policies. It has to be built on values and principles. So why isn't it? Well, it's because everything is governed by short-termism, and it's just sort of pragmatic tactics from getting from one place to the next, rather than the deep thinking, the deep engagement with the deep frames of life, trying to sort of find the right cognitive pathways which show us the practical pathways we should then take. That should be the stuff of politics. It should be informed by deep understanding, an understanding which isn't just political, isn't just economic, isn't just environmental, but is psycho-spiritual as well. Understanding how people work, what motivates them, why, what a better life looks like, and why we might wish to lead it. And unfortunately, that is utterly alien at the moment to most of the political sphere.
You refer in your book several times to embarrassment, and this really resonated with me. You talk about an embarrassment which prohibits politicians from stating their principles clearly. Embarrassment is essentially, as you describe it, a block to humans achieving their potential. And I wondered if you could just elaborate on that theme.
There's a sort of cultural cringe in the politics which seeks a more generous and inclusive world, which incidentally is not shared by the fascist and proto-fascist politics which seek a more exclusive world and which seek to stamp on the heads of other people. They're not embarrassed. They don't care. They'll state their twisted values with utter boldness, and we cower in the face of it, and we say, well, you know, yes, what do we believe in? Well, yes, what we want is to cut carbon emissions by X% by such and such a date. What we want is to have a bit more social housing. You know, we just talk policies rather than here is our prescription for a better world, and here, more importantly still, which is neither values nor principles nor policies, here is a narrative framework that we're going to create within which to deliver that better world. And this is the key thing, and this is really what my book is about, is creating a new narrative framework, because what governs politics is not political leaders, it's not political parties, it is big political stories. If you look at the past 70 years, you can divide them more or less neatly in the middle between the first 35 years governed by one big political story, Keynesian social democracy, second by another, neoliberalism. And at the height of Keynesianism, everyone was a Keynesian. Richard Nixon is alleged to have said, we're all Keynesians now. It didn't matter whether you were Conservative, Labour, Democrat, Republican, you were Keynesian. And then through neoliberalism, everybody's become a neoliberalism. Doesn't matter whether you're Labour, Conservative, Democrat, Republican, you became a neoliberal. Labour's now changing from that, but that was how it was under Blair, for example, and Brown. They were fundamentally neoliberal. It becomes the common sense. It becomes the dominant story which governs everything, and people just fall into line with it. Well, we need to create a new common sense. We need a new narrative with a particular structure which works again and again in politics and, for that matter, in religion, which is the restoration story. The land has fallen into disorder due to the activities of powerful and nefarious forces working against the good of humanity. We, the heroes of the story, will confront those forces, overthrow them, and restore order to the land. That's the story which has worked for thousands of years in all its different variants. Keynesian social democracy uses that structure. Neoliberalism uses that structure. They hate each other's guts, but they use exactly the same narrative framework. So what I've tried to create in this book is a new narrative framework based on that restoration story as a narrative arc.
And finally, I wanted to ask you a question which is probably asked often to political writers, and it's, for you personally, why have you chosen writing and activism rather than politics?
Because I couldn't do anything else, basically. I outside my narrow field, I'm completely useless. Look, this is politics. You know, it's not party politics, but it is a crucial part of politics. In fact, the idea that the only valid form of political engagement is to be an MP suggests that out of the 67 million people in Britain, only 650 actually have a valid political role to play. That's ridiculous. We should all consider ourselves to be politicians. We should all consider ourselves to be deeply engaged in politics, because whether we know it or not, we are. And for any political party to be successful, it requires a hinterland of thinking and activism and engagement, not just voting, but working all through the 4 or 5 years between elections. By a whole host of people who aren't necessarily affiliated with that party. And I have no membership myself. I've never had an affiliation because I feel as a writer I should stand back from it. But I feel I am totally politically committed and have been throughout my entire adult life. And doing what I do, which, as I say, is one of the very few things I'm capable of doing, gives me the freedom I would never have in party politics. I couldn't write a book like this. I couldn't be talking about stuff like this in party politics, because I would have the media breathing down my neck, coming down on me, say, oh, he said this, oh, let's pick that apart. Ah, right, this proves he's a terrorist, or this proves he's a communist, or this proves something or other. Because, of course, that's, you know, the whole drive of the media is to just tear apart any new ideas, anything which might threaten the status quo. And so to be someone whose life's work is threatening the status quo, or at least trying, I can't be in party politics. It would simply be impossible. But I hope to be able to feed into party politics and to create a better environment in which that kind of politics can begin to expand. And you know, you can do that. It's been done many, many times, where you create the intellectual environment, you create the activist environment, and then suddenly party politics has a space in which to expand. You create that political space.
Thank you so much for writing the book. It's such a lucid and thought-provoking book, and I want to thank you both for writing it and for your time this afternoon.